The summer of 1940 was meant to be Britain's stand against the tide, the moment an island fortress defied the weight of a continent enslaved. But history is never guaranteed, and victory is never inevitable. In this suppressed chapter of the war, the skies did not protect, the seas did not shield, and the myth of an unconquerable Britain dissolved in fire and hunger. What followed was not triumph, but collapse. A world rewritten by the fall of a nation that was never meant to fall. This is the story we were never meant to hear. In the late summer of 1940, the skies above southern England were meant to be the stage of defiance, the theatre where a nation stood alone against tyranny. Yet in this hidden chronology, buried within long-suppressed Air Ministry files and coded communiqué, the story unfolds differently. The Luftwaffe did not falter in its bid for air superiority. It triumphed. The Battle of Britain, so long celebrated as the RAF's finest hour, became instead the moment when Britain's lifeline snapped. The collapse began quietly, with the steady attrition of fighter command. Intelligence summaries from Bletchley Park warned of the scale of German operations. Coordinated strikes on radar stations, systematic bombing of sector airfields, and unrelenting pressure on the overstretched squadrons. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, once hailed as saviors, were forced into desperate sorties without sufficient maintenance, without rest for their pilots. Records speak of pilots flying 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day, their nerves shattered by fatigue, their aircraft riddled with bullet holes patched overnight by exhausted ground crews. Attrition became unsustainable. By mid-September, entire squadrons were reduced to a handful of serviceable aircraft. The turning point came when the Luftwaffe, abandoning its missteps of targeting London too early, maintained its relentless focus on airfields and radar. Biggin Hill, North Weald, Hornchurch, all pounded into rubble. Fighter Command's control and reporting system, the very spine of Britain's air defence, fractured under the weight of the assault. Group commanders reported blind sectors where no radar coverage remained. Fighter pilots scrambled too late, or too few, to intercept massed bomber formations escorted by hundreds of Messerschmitt Bf-109s. "We are being hunted in our own skies," one pilot scribbled in a letter never posted, later recovered from a downed Hurricane. As the weeks passed, the British public began to sense the shift. Where once they cheered the vapour trails above the Thames as evidence of resistance, now they watched helplessly as enemy bombers crossed unchallenged. Casualty reports mounted. The few dwindled toward extinction. Fighter Command in secret. Memoranda between Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Winston Churchill admitted that reserves of trained pilots had been exhausted. Replacement crews, hastily pulled from training schools, were shot down on their first missions. "We are feeding boys into a furnace," one Air Vice Marshal confided, his despair preserved only in notes marked "most secret." By late September, the German Luftwaffe claimed the skies. Operation Adlertag, the Day of the Eagle, achieved its objective: air superiority over the Channel. For the first time since 1588, Britain's survival hung by a thread. The German High Command, emboldened by the RAF's collapse, accelerated plans for Operation Sailor, Sea Lion, the long-feared invasion of southern England. Preparations that had seemed tentative, disorganized, even theatrical, suddenly carried the weight of inevitability. The short-term consequences were catastrophic. Without air cover, the Royal Navy faced daylight massacres. Convoys carrying vital food and war supplies were torn apart by coordinated bomber and U-boat attacks. Coastal towns bore the scars of invasion rehearsals by fire. Southampton's docks cratered, Dover's defences shredded. On the ground, morale began to falter. The government, still issuing Churchill's defiant words, now whispered contingency plans in the halls of Whitehall. Operation Banquet, arming civilian home guards with outdated weapons and makeshift explosives, was quietly activated. Gas masks were distributed not as precaution, but in grim expectation of chemical warfare. But it was the long-term ripples that defined this alternative war. With Britain silenced in the skies, Roosevelt faced an impossible choice. American intelligence, through cables now declassified, assessed that Britain could not hold without immediate US intervention. Yet in 1940, the American public was not ready to send its sons into another European war. Isolationist voices in Congress gained momentum, pointing to Britain's failure as proof that resistance was futile. Roosevelt, constrained by political reality, limited aid to what could be smuggled through a collapsing Atlantic supply chain. The famed Lend-Lease program, which in another timeline gave Britain strength to endure, was delayed, scaled back, perhaps rendered meaningless. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German strategists debated the scale of their next move. Hitler, long reluctant to risk a full-scale amphibious invasion, was persuaded by Göring's triumph in the air. Kriegsmarine officers, wary of their vulnerability, nevertheless prepared barges and landing craft under cover of Luftwaffe dominance. The Wehrmacht, battle-hardened from France, waited only for the order. Classified war diaries suggest that, even without total naval superiority, German planners believed that Britain's broken morale and fractured command would collapse once a foothold was established. The island fortress myth was already crumbling. Domestically, Britain entered a spiral of fear and uncertainty. Diaries from Londoners describe sleepless nights not from bombs, but from the gnawing terror of invasion. Rumours of German parachutists landing in the countryside spread like wildfire. Police intercepted panicked reports of enemy soldiers that turned out to be lost farmers or wandering refugees. Civil order teetered on collapse. Churchill, for all his rhetoric, was forced to confront the possibility of relocating the government to Canada, a move once dismissed as hysteria, but now discussed in earnest cabinet meetings. The Soviet Union, watching events unfold with suspicion, reconsidered its position. Stalin, uncertain of Hitler's ultimate intentions, viewed a Britain on the verge of defeat as both opportunity and danger. In this timeline, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact carried greater weight. With Germany unchallenged in the West, the Soviet Union faced an emboldened Reich sooner, without the breathing space granted by Britain's survival. Eastern Europe became an even more precarious frontier. The war in North Africa faltered almost instantly. With Britain's attention consumed by defense of its home isles, supply lines to Egypt collapsed. Rommel's Africa Corps, once checked, by stubborn British resistance, surged forward unchecked. Alexandria fell, the Suez Canal lost. The Middle East, rich in oil, shifted into German hands, creating a strategic dominance that altered the global balance. And beyond the war's immediate theatres, the long shadow reached into the future. With Britain subdued, the United States faced a Nazi-dominated Europe long before Pearl Harbor. The dream of a grand alliance was crippled before it began. Washington's ability to project power into Europe vanished without British bases. The Cold War that would have emerged decades later between Washington and Moscow was now reframed. An early, brutal confrontation with a Berlin that held the continent under its grip. The tragedy of this alternate history lies in its plausibility. The RAF's margin of survival in 1940 was vanishingly thin. A shift in German strategy, a continuation of their assault on airfields rather than the diversion to London, could have broken the backbone of fighter command. Britain's survival truly hung by a thread. In this hidden chronology, that thread snapped. The eagle, once rising in defense, was broken. And with it, the course of the 20th century was irrevocably altered. By October 1940, with the Luftwaffe's grip over the skies secure, the fate of Britain shifted to the waters of the English Channel. For centuries, this narrow strip of sea had been both shield and artery, an unbreachable moat and the nation's lifeline to the wider world. But in this version of events drawn from once sealed Admiralty records and coded naval dispatches, the Channel became a graveyard. The Royal Navy, battered and isolated, could no longer guarantee Britain's survival. Admiralty war diaries reveal the chilling sequence. With the RAF shattered, daylight convoys became suicidal ventures. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Kanalkampf, on a scale far greater than anything imagined in the official history. Heinkel, H111s, and Junkers, Ju-87. Stukas swept over merchant fleets with impunity, their bombs striking home on fuel tankers and food ships. The Channel ran slick with burning oil. Destroyers scrambled from Portsmouth and Plymouth to provide cover, but were cut down in daylight by precision dive bombers. Loss reports describe HMS Acasta and HMS Brazen, lost within hours, their crews left clinging to debris, strafed as they awaited rescue. For the Royal Navy, the choice was cruel. Stay in port and watch the nation starve, or sail into skies dominated by the Luftwaffe and suffer annihilation. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, wrote in a suppressed memorandum that Britain was fighting with a cut throat, bleeding with every convoy, yet powerless to stem the tide. Secret minutes from war cabinet meetings record Churchill, demanding convoys sail regardless, knowing full well they were sacrificial offerings to keep Britain breathing for another week. The impact on the civilian population was immediate and brutal. London and Liverpool, already scarred by the Blitz, now faced food shortages. Imported grain, oil, and armaments that sustained the war effort dwindled. Long queues outside ration offices turned into riots in dockside cities when promised shipments never arrived. "We were told to endure the bombs," one diary from Portsmouth reads. But how do you endure hunger? Civil unrest grew so severe that the Home Office circulated plans to deploy the army domestically, not to repel Germans, but to keep order among its own starving population. Meanwhile, German U-boats, freed from British patrol aircraft overhead, extended their reach with devastating efficiency. Wolf packs roamed the Atlantic approaches, sinking freighters in sight of the Irish coast. The United States, watching from afar, debated whether to risk its merchant ships on what newspapers called suicide runs to a dying island. Roosevelt, sympathetic but constrained, authorized limited escorts only to Iceland. Britain's once legendary maritime mastery seemed a relic. The Channel itself, once assumed to be Britain's natural barrier, had become a trap. Naval planners, poring over Operation Sealower scenarios, admitted in private that without air superiority, any Royal Navy sortie against an invasion fleet would amount to slaughter in daylight. The Luftwaffe's dominance turned the Channel into a German lake. German barges, once thought too vulnerable, now crossed in daylight rehearsals, shielded by swarms of Messerschmitts. For British sailors who watched from coastal cliffs, it was a nightmare made real, an invasion rehearsal unfolding unopposed. The short-term consequences cascaded quickly. Fuel shortages crippled the RAF's remaining training flights. Tanks in North Africa sat idle as convoys carrying replacement parts never arrived. In the north, Scotland and Northern Ireland found themselves cut off from the industrial heart of England as rail transport broke under the strain of fuel scarcity. By November, even the daily bread ration fell to levels not seen since the First World War. Civil defence authorities warned that continued shortages would erode morale to the breaking point. But the long-term ripples were even more profound. British Empire outposts, reliant on shipping for coordination, began to fragment. Communications with India and Australia, once sustained by a steady flow of ships and telegrams, faltered. In the absence of steady supplies, colonial administrations grew uncertain of London's authority. Classified correspondence between the Colonial Office and governors in Canada reveals a desperate request to stockpile resources and prepare for an emergency transfer of the British government should the homeland be rendered incapable of sustaining itself. On the diplomatic front, the fall of Britain's maritime dominance sent shockwaves through Europe. Neutral nations, from Spain to Turkey, now weighed whether Germany's star was ascendant beyond challenge. Franco, long cautious, began negotiating more openly with Berlin, contemplating full Axis entry with Gibraltar as the prize. Turkey, observing Britain's isolation, distanced itself from Allied commitments, keeping the Bosporus closed to British shipping. The strategic balance tilted inexorably toward the Reich. For Germany, this collapse of Britain's naval defence was not merely a tactical victory, but a geopolitical earthquake. Hitler, emboldened, proclaimed that the Royal Navy was a rusting dagger pointed at the heart of Europe, now broken. Declassified OKW, German High Command memos, reveal confidence that Britain, once starved and isolated, could be compelled to negotiate terms short of outright invasion. The collapse of supply lines created the perfect leverage: surrender by famine. And yet, perhaps the most haunting revelations lie in the private diaries of naval officers themselves. Commodore H.W. Biggs wrote that he had never imagined a day when the Royal Navy, the pride of Britain for centuries, would be forced into passivity. "We are watching the noose tighten," he penned in October 1940. Not in some far-flung theatre, but here, in our own channel. The sea no longer belongs to us, it belongs to them. The war that followed in this hidden chronology bore little resemblance to the one known to history. Britain, once bastion of resistance, became a besieged island, unable to project power, unable even to feed itself. And as the seas closed, so too did the nation's options. The Channel, Britain's eternal shield, had become its coffin lid. The empire's heart starved while the world held its breath. And behind every lost convoy, every burning freighter, lay the unspoken truth. The Channel was shut, and with it, the last hope of survival without surrender. It began in the chill of dawn, 21st September 1940. What had long been dismissed by many British strategists as a bluff became reality. Operation Siloe, Sea Lion, was no longer a paper exercise, but an invasion unleashed. For months, German barges had gathered in French and Belgian ports under the watchful eye of the Royal Navy, assumed too fragile for a cross-channel assault. Yet in this alternative history, with the Luftwaffe dominant and the Channel shut, the risks no longer outweighed the opportunity. Britain's defences were about to be tested not by the spectre of invasion, but by its brutal reality. German planning documents, once hidden in Allied intelligence files marked ultra-secret, reveal the precision of the assault. At 0430, waves of paratroopers from the 7th Flieger Division dropped near Ashford and Maidstone, tasked with seizing bridges and cutting rail lines feeding London. Simultaneously, the first wave of barges pushed off from Calais and Boulogne, packed with infantry from the 9th and 16th Armies. Luftwaffe fighter screens hovered above, ensuring the slow, vulnerable convoys were shielded from what little resistance the RAF could muster. By dawn, the Kent coastline saw its first landings, German infantry wading ashore through surf under the cover of Stuka dive bombers, hammering pillboxes and coastal artillery. The Home Guard, immortalized in popular memory as plucky but amateurish, faced their grim baptism of fire. Diaries from civilians in Folkestone describe the surreal sight of shopkeepers, farmers, and retired veterans clutching Lee Enfield rifles and hunting shotguns, firing desperately into the surf as German troops stormed ashore. Some resistance held. The beach defences at Hythe inflicted heavy casualties, but where coordination faltered, the Wehrmacht advanced rapidly inland. The Royal Navy, attempting to sortie from Portsmouth to disrupt the landings, was decimated by Luftwaffe squadrons. HMS Repulse, one of the fleet's capital ships, was struck repeatedly and forced to beach itself near the Isle of Wight to avoid sinking. By noon, the reality was clear. Britain was under invasion, and the sea was no longer its shield. Whitehall descended into chaos. War Cabinet minutes, preserved only in heavily redacted transcripts, describe frantic debates. Some ministers urged immediate use of chemical weapons stockpiled under Operation Lucid, believing mustard gas could stall the invaders on the beaches. Others warned that retaliation would invite German gas attacks on London and Birmingham. Churchill, his defiance intact but his options shrinking, ordered all reserves thrown toward Kent. The 1st London Division, under-equipped and weary from constant mobilization, marched south into a storm of artillery and Luftwaffe strafing. VE psychological impact on the population was immediate. Radio broadcasts, once symbols of calm resolve, shifted to desperate appeals for order. Rumors spread of German parachutists disguised as nuns, of saboteurs already infiltrating the countryside. Civilian refugees clogged the roads, hampering troop movements. Railway stations became scenes of panic, filled with families fleeing north, with whatever possessions they could carry. "The war had come to our fields," one evacuee later wrote in an unpublished memoir. "We were no longer observers, we were prey." The German advance was not without obstacles. British engineers demolished key bridges across the Medway, slowing panzer divisions eager to push toward London. Resistance groups, hastily organized under MI5 directives, launched sabotage raids on German supply depots, echoing tactics later perfected by resistance movements across occupied Europe. Yet the Wehrmacht's momentum was undeniable. By late September, German forces held a corridor stretching from Dover to Canterbury. Luftwaffe bombers shifted their fury from London's docks to railway junctions feeding reinforcements into the southeast. The capital braced for encirclement. The short-term consequences were devastating. Britain's command structure fractured under the pressure. General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, urged withdrawal of forces north of the Thames to preserve a defensive line around Birmingham and Manchester. Churchill resisted, insisting London must not fall, but German strategy aimed precisely to force such a collapse, drawing British reserves into a cauldron battle around the capital, while the Kriegsmarine ferried reinforcements across the Channel. Within weeks, German commandos had seized sections of the port of Dover, establishing a tenuous but functional supply line. Long-term, the implications were catastrophic. With Britain under partial occupation, Roosevelt's plans for Lend-Lease became politically untenable. American newspapers carried headlines of German troops in Kent, of British ministers preparing evacuation to Canada. Isolationist voices in Congress thundered, "Why send aid to a nation already lost?" The United States bridgehead into Europe, essential to the eventual D-Day landings, vanished before it could be conceived. Washington faced a Europe dominated by Berlin with no ally on the continent. The ripple effects reached Moscow as well. Stalin, unnerved by Germany's success, accelerated Soviet defensive preparations, but hesitated to provoke Hitler. With Britain broken, Stalin's confidence in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact deepened, at least temporarily. Soviet planners calculated that without Britain as a distraction, Germany's eventual focus would turn east, but not until the Reich had consolidated its hold on the West. In this altered timeline, Operation Barbarossa was delayed, buying Stalin time, but at the cost of Europe's last independent democracy. For the British people, the occupation was a wound deeper than the Blitz. Villages in Kent and Sussex fell under martial law, German troops requisitioning homes, barns, and schools as barracks. Civilians endured curfews enforced with brutal efficiency. Resistance fighters who struck at convoys faced swift reprisals. Entire towns threatened with destruction for acts of sabotage. Churchill, his fiery words now broadcast from Halifax, Nova Scotia, became the leader of a government in exile. The defiant bulldog remained, but he was no longer in London. He was a voice across the Atlantic, urging resistance while the homeland burned. The world order bent beneath the weight of this event. Without Britain as a base of operations, the United States had no springboard into Europe. The Mediterranean, dominated by Axis forces after the fall of Egypt, cut off Allied influence. Japan, emboldened by Britain's collapse, pressed its advance in Southeast Asia, calculating that Western powers would be unable to respond effectively. The balance of the Second World War shifted not over the fields of Stalingrad or the beaches of Normandy, but on the shingle shores of Kent, where the Wehrmacht achieved what centuries of invaders had failed to do. The invasion did not end the war immediately. Pockets of resistance endured in Wales, in Scotland, and in the industrial north. The Royal Navy, battered but not destroyed, maintained outposts in the Atlantic. Yet the myth of Britain as an unbreakable fortress was shattered. In this suppressed version of history, the island nation was breached, its capital threatened, its government scattered. The war was no longer about Britain holding out until help arrived. It became instead a war for survival under occupation, a struggle that would define the century in ways history never recorded. Operation Sea Lion, so long relegated to speculation, found its place not in discarded plans, but in blood and fire, on English soil. And once the Germans crossed the Channel, the war itself was never the same. The fall of London was not marked by a single moment, but by a slow collapse under fire and fear. By October 1940, German artillery positioned in Kent could already reach the outskirts of the capital. Luftwaffe raids, no longer harassed by fighter command, pounded the city without pause. Docklands blazed, Whitehall was scarred by craters, and the Thames became a corridor of burning wreckage. When the cabinet finally convened in the underground chambers beneath Westminster, the discussion no longer centered on holding the city, but on whether the government itself could survive. Declassified cabinet minutes, stamped "most secret," Dominion distribution only, reveal the tone of those desperate debates. Churchill thundered against any thought of surrender, insisting Britain could continue the fight from abroad if necessary. "We may lose this island," he is recorded as saying, "but we must not lose the cause." Yet behind the rhetoric lay grim logistical calculations: how to evacuate ministers, how to safeguard the gold reserves of the Bank of England, and how to transfer the machinery of government to Canada. Operation Backbone, once a contingency scribbled in planning offices, became the desperate blueprint for survival. On 3rd November, the order was given. Under cover of night, a convoy of warships slipped from Liverpool, carrying key cabinet members, crown jewels, and critical archives. Churchill, accompanied by his war cabinet and a skeleton staff, boarded HMS Renown. German bombers prowled overhead, but cloud cover shielded the fleet as it steamed westward. Days later, the Prime Minister of Britain arrived not in London, but in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The government in exile had begun. The shockwaves were immediate. In Britain, the symbolism of Churchill's departure reverberated like a death knell. BBC broadcasts, relayed via Canadian transmitters, carried his voice insisting he had not abandoned his people, but rather taken up position to continue the war on safer ground. Yet in the streets of London and Manchester, many saw only betrayal. Letters intercepted by MI5 spoke of civilians accusing the government of fleeing, while the island was left to starve and burn. German propaganda broadcasts seized the moment, portraying Churchill as a coward who had abandoned his post while the Führer's new Europe marched forward. Meanwhile, the machinery of British governance struggled to reconstitute itself. Across the Atlantic, in Ottawa, hastily converted offices became ministries, and Parliament convened in emergency session alongside Canadian officials. Dominion leaders found themselves elevated overnight to positions of global consequence. Mackenzie, King, Canada's cautious Prime Minister, now hosted the seat of the British Empire, a responsibility he neither sought nor welcomed. Internal memoranda revealed deep unease in Ottawa about whether Canada could bear the strain of sustaining Britain's government, especially as U-boats prowled the North Atlantic. For the Allies, Churchill in exile altered the calculus of war. Roosevelt maintained his personal admiration for the man, but politically, the optics were disastrous. American newspapers framed the evacuation as proof that Britain was finished. The Chicago Tribune carried the headline, "Churchill flees, Britain lost?" Isolationists in Congress seized on the narrative, demanding Roosevelt halt all aid. With Britain's capital occupied and its government displaced, the case for massive US involvement weakened dramatically. Inside Europe, the effects were even more profound. De Gaulle, leading the Free French from London, now found himself a guest in Canada. His authority, already fragile, was undermined by the perception that Britain itself had fallen. Resistance movements across occupied Europe, who once looked to London for inspiration, now received only faint broadcasts from across an ocean. The beacon of hope dimmed, and with it, the coordination and morale of underground networks weakened. The Germans wasted no time consolidating their propaganda victory. Newsreels in occupied Paris and Berlin showed footage of Whitehall in ruins, intercut with Churchill boarding a warship. Goebbels declared the end of perfidious Albion and claimed Hitler had spared the island further destruction only out of mercy. Secretly, German occupation forces in southern England worked ruthlessly to stamp out resistance. But abroad, the narrative of British collapse became a powerful diplomatic weapon. Neutral nations such as Spain, Sweden, and Turkey edged closer to Berlin, convinced the Reich was unstoppable. The immediate suffering inside Britain deepened. With London effectively under German control, occupation authorities imposed curfews, seized broadcast facilities, and installed a collaborationist council to administer daily affairs. Civilian accounts smuggled out describe German patrols on Piccadilly, soldiers billeted in schools, and Union Jacks torn down from government buildings. Hunger became weaponized as the Reich controlled incoming shipments of food, distributing rations only in exchange for cooperation. Churchill's calls from across the Atlantic for resistance clashed with the brutal reality of survival under occupation. The long-term consequences were seismic. The British Empire, already strained, began to fragment. India, seeing Britain humbled and its leaders scattered abroad, pushed harder for independence, with Gandhi's movement gaining unprecedented momentum. In the Middle East, local leaders weighed aligning with Germany, calculating that London no longer held the power to enforce its will. South Africa and Australia, still loyal but geographically distant, prepared for the possibility that they would be left to face Axis expansion in their regions alone. For the Soviets, the exile of Churchill signaled an altered timetable. Stalin, reassured that Germany now dominated the West, sought to strengthen Soviet defenses but avoided confrontation. Secret Soviet diplomatic cables reveal that Stalin explored a deeper economic alignment with the Reich, hoping to delay the inevitable clash. Operation Barbarossa, in this chronology, was postponed as Hitler shifted focus to consolidating his hold over Britain and the Mediterranean. And yet, even in exile, Churchill refused to concede. His speeches, broadcast via shortwave from Ottawa, retained their defiant fire. "We shall fight in exile. We shall fight from every shore that remains free. We shall never surrender," he declared in December 1940. For some, these words rekindled hope. For others, they rang hollow, distant echoes from a man thousands of miles away. History remembers Churchill as the indomitable leader who stood firm in London's darkest hour. But in this hidden version, he became instead a fugitive statesman, defiant. Yes, but displaced. His bulldog spirit remained intact, but his bark now carried across an ocean, a reminder not of unbroken resistance, but of a capital lost, a nation fractured, and an empire fighting for survival from exile. The war, once Britain's to endure at home, had become an overseas struggle for relevance, with the homeland under foreign boots. The image of Churchill in exile captures the tragedy of this alternative war. A man who embodied defiance, forced to wage his battle not from the heart of London, but from the periphery of empire. A leader without a land, urging a resistance whose voice could scarcely be heard beneath the jackboots on Whitehall. By early 1941, with Britain under occupation and its government operating from exile in Canada, the Atlantic ceased to be a bridge between allies and became instead a widening gulf. For centuries, the ocean had connected Europe to North America. Now it severed them. The consequences of Britain's collapse rippled outward, leaving the United States to face a new and unsettling reality. A Europe unified under German control, long before American industry and public opinion were prepared for war. Declassified US State Department cables describe the paralysis in Washington. Reports from American diplomats in London, now relayed through clandestine channels in Lisbon, spoke of German officers patrolling Whitehall, of British collaborators administering ration books under swastika flags. Churchill's exiled broadcasts from Ottawa, carried faintly across shortwave, urged Roosevelt to stand firm. But the political reality in the United States was starkly different. With Britain reduced to a besieged remnant, isolationist voices gained unprecedented strength. Senator Robert Taft declared Britain a lost cause and argued that pouring American resources into its support would be throwing food and weapons into the sea. The America First Committee, led by Charles Lindbergh, swelled in membership, using images of German troops in London to argue that resistance to the Reich was futile. For Roosevelt, the dilemma was excruciating. He believed the United States could not afford a world where Nazi Germany dominated the European continent, yet he lacked the political mandate to act. Without Britain as a staging ground, the logistical path to Europe seemed impossible. War. Department memoranda assessed that any American landing on the continent would now require either Iceland as a forward base or direct negotiations with Vichy France for Mediterranean access, both deemed near-suicidal gambles against a Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine operating at the height of their power. Meanwhile, Germany exploited its triumph with ruthless efficiency. With Britain subdued, Hitler declared the Atlantic Wall not as a future project, but as a present reality. U-boats swarmed outward, their bases now extending from Scapa Flow in Scotland to the Azores, seized from Portugal under heavy German pressure. The Atlantic became a hunting ground where American shipping was stalked openly. Convoys once shielded by the Royal Navy now ran unescorted, and US merchant losses spiked. German propaganda broadcasts taunted the United States, declaring the Atlantic our ocean. The ripple effects were global. Japan, emboldened by Britain's collapse, accelerated its expansion in the Pacific. With Singapore captured far earlier and Australia left without a reliable ally, the balance in Asia tilted rapidly. Roosevelt faced the grim prospect of two oceans dominated by enemies, one by Berlin, the other by Tokyo, without reliable bases to contest either. Classified US Navy war games in early 1941 painted a dire picture. Even if America mobilized fully, it could not fight effectively on two fronts without Britain. The Soviet Union, too, recalculated its position. Stalin, convinced that Hitler would not turn east until he had consolidated his control in the West, extended economic cooperation with Germany. Soviet shipments of grain, oil, and raw materials to the Reich increased, binding Moscow to Berlin, in a tense but pragmatic partnership. The timeline of Operation Barbarossa shifted. Instead of June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union was delayed as Germany exploited Britain's fall to secure the Mediterranean and push deeper into the Middle East. The oil of Iraq and Iran became targets, drawing the Reich into regions that in another history were contested far later. Domestically, the United States wrestled with its identity. Polls conducted by Gallup showed nearly 70% of Americans opposed to direct involvement in the war by mid-1941. Newspapers framed the conflict as a European tragedy from which America must remain detached. Yet Roosevelt, in private correspondence with Churchill, expressed his anguish. "Without your island, Franklin," Churchill wrote in a cable, "the torch cannot be carried to the continent. We have become a whisper across an ocean." Roosevelt replied with equal candor, "Without your island, Winston, we have no road to Europe at all." By 1942, the geopolitical landscape bore little resemblance to the war remembered today. Europe was sealed behind the iron shield of Nazi power. Britain, under occupation, became both a propaganda prize and a strategic stronghold for Germany. The United States, cut off and isolated, turned inward, fortifying its coasts and expanding its navy, but unable to project meaningful force across an ocean dominated by U-boats and bombers. The Atlantic Divide became more than a geographic barrier. It was a psychological chasm. Americans, watching footage of German parades in Trafalgar Square, questioned whether democracy itself could survive in a world where the Reich dictated the terms of order. Roosevelt pushed for rearmament, invoking the Monroe Doctrine as justification for preparing to defend the Western Hemisphere. But his critics argued that America should negotiate spheres of influence with Berlin, conceding Europe in exchange for non-interference in the Americas. Long-term consequences spread even further. Without a liberated Britain to rally behind, occupied nations in Europe faced despair. Resistance movements, cut off from supplies and safe havens, dwindled into scattered cells. Many fell silent under the weight of German reprisals. France, already subdued, saw collaboration deepen as Vichy officials pointed to Britain's failure as proof that compromise was survival. Spain and Turkey, now confident of German supremacy, aligned more openly with the Axis, closing off any hope of Mediterranean access for American forces. And in Canada, the government in exile struggled with its role. Churchill's speeches from Ottawa inspired some, but the logistical reality was grim. The Royal Canadian Navy, brave though it was, could not replace the might of the Royal Navy. The exiled British administration faced dwindling influence, its calls for resistance fading. Beneath the thunder of German consolidation, Canada itself, stretched to support both its own defense and the British exiles, began to fracture politically under the strain. The Atlantic, once the lifeline of freedom, had become its tomb. The divide between Europe and America was not just one of distance, but of fate. A Europe unified under Nazi Germany stood impenetrable, while America watched from across the sea, uncertain whether to intervene or to bargain. The Cold War, that in another world would emerge between Washington and Moscow, never took shape here. Instead, the great rivalry loomed between Washington and Berlin, an uneasy standoff across an ocean that had once carried allies, but now carried only fear. In this hidden chronology, the Second World War was not decided on the beaches of Normandy or in the ruins of Stalingrad, but in the collapse of Britain. With the Eagle fallen and the Channel closed, the Atlantic became the ultimate barrier, a divide that left the United States isolated, Europe enslaved, and the world order reshaped in ways history never dared to record. When Britain's defences crumbled, the course of the century shifted with it. An occupied London, a silenced navy, a government in exile, these were the fractures that reshaped the world before it could take the shape we know. Across the seas, America watched. Across the East, Stalin calculated. Across the globe, empires unraveled. And in the silence left behind, the question lingers like smoke over the ruins. What if the island that stood alone had not stood at all? The answer is, not memory, but warning, etched in the shadows of history.